everyone, and thank you very much for joining today's In Conversation With. My name is Davina, and I'm the Youth Coordinator for Hindu Climate Action, and I will be your host for today. So our monthly In Conversation With highlights the work of climate activists and organisations here in the UK. We hope that through showcasing these community members, more people will feel inspired to join the important cause. So today, I'm joined with Samantha Woods. Samantha Woods has spent over 35 years exploring different ways organisations and individuals can live simple and fulfilling lives without damaging themselves or the world. Sam is qualified as a permaculture teacher and is a Think Like a Tree facilitator. She has focused increasingly on empowering actions by individuals and grassroots organisations. In her day job, she works for the Conservative Volunteers, a national charity that seeks to connect people with green spaces and specialises in helping people take their first steps with growing their own food. So thank you so much for being here today, Sam, and let's begin. So, as you can probably tell, based on Sam's incredible expertise, this month's theme is growing your own food. So now that we're coming into June, and I think we can all agree with this bank holiday weather, we've been very, very lucky. Would you be able to shed some light on what types of food are best for growing in this period?
Yeah, hi Davina. Thanks very much for inviting me on. So we're coming into June, so we're kind of coming to the end of the sort of the big rush of the spring growing season, but there's still lots of things that you can be sowing and growing now. So things like your French beans, or all different kinds of beans and peas you can be sowing in June. And you can also be sowing a lot of your kind of cabbage family, so things like red and white cabbages, purple sprouting broccoli, cauliflower, kale, all of those really healthy kind of greens that we all love so much. You can be sowing now. And of course, you can also be doing sort of sowings of your kind of roots as well. So things like carrots. Yesterday I was out in my garden planting carrots and beetroots as well. So again, really good for your smoothies, sort of just sowing those straight into the garden. And all year round, you can be growing all your herbs and things, whether that's indoors or outdoors. So if you've got a sunny windowsill, you can be growing your lovely herbs like I've got some windowsill basil here, things like parsley, coriander, things. It really depends on, what you like to grow and what kind of space you've got. We're getting a little bit late in the season now for starting off things like tomatoes and cucumbers though. So if you haven't started those off yet, the best thing to do would be to find a friend who has and get some of their spare seedlings and start planting those out now that we've got into the sunny weather.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. And for new gardeners who might be a bit kind of precautious of what to do and maybe a bit concerned with how to grow, kind of what would you say would be some tips? And also kind of what resource do you need for growing? Do you need to be concerned with how much room you've got? Do you need a greenhouse? These are quite kind of, people are very unsure. So what would you say to them kind of questions?
Yeah, I would say start by looking at sort of the amount of space that you've got to grow in. So as you can grow some of your own food, whether you've got a tiny space, like even just a windowsill, to a little patio garden where you're going to grow in containers, to a biggish garden, to an allotment. So you need to look at the space that you've got available and also think about what you want to grow and how much time and energy you want to put into it, and also how much you want to spend, because inevitably there is a bit of startup cost if you've not done any growing before. If you've got no tools and no pots and no nothing, then there is a little bit of cost to starting up. But seeds are relatively cheap. So one of the things to do is, if you're growing in your garden, is to try and have a look at your soil. So two things to really look at is what kind of soil have you got? So, dig a little bit up, have a look at it, see, does it hold in a ball? If you sort of squidge it together, does it hold in a ball? If it does, it's probably got more clay in it. If it feels rough when you rub it between your hands, then it's probably got more sand in. So the best kind of soil for growing vegetables is going to be not too much clay and not too much sand. so you need to put some compost in to try and get the soil going, and to make it a nice kind of medium for growing your vegetables in. Or if you're growing in pots, then you're going to need to actually buy some compost to fill your pots and that kind of thing. But you can do a lot with sharing. So you can do, and you can also do a lot with upcycling. So, most of the pots that I grow in, these little kind of plant pots, these are things where I've bought a plant in a pot and then I just reuse the pots over and over again. But you can also grow even in toilet rolls. You can make paper pots, you can use egg cartons. So if you haven't got a lot of resource, one thing to do is to raid your recycling bin for little trays and, things that you can reuse to sow your seeds in. And then also, we have in Leicester, we have, and other places across the country, you will find people that will seed swap or swap seedlings with you. So if you put a call out on your social media, you'll probably get people donating you plants as well that you can start off with. But understanding the soil that you've got in your space, and understanding things like how sunny is it, have you got a very shady garden, or have you got a very sunny garden, what time of day do you get the sun, is it south facing or north facing, that kind of thing. That's going to give you a bit of a guide to what you can grow. So if, for example, you've got a very shady garden, you can still grow things like mint. Mint will grow in the shade. Even strawberries will grow in the shade, although they won't get quite as sweet. Things like currants will grow in the shade. So you need to kind of think about what your garden is like and try and grow the things that fit into that kind of space. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, of course. So you've really got to, in a sense, do a bit of a garden analysis, see the best kind of food that would grow in your garden, and then go from there.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about how much you want to spend as well. So some people like to, create a really, put in paths and have ponds and, a lot of structure. Yeah. But you can, also just get a few pots and just have a go and just try something. And then, if you want to then develop it, if you then want to put in kind of raised beds or whatever to grow in, you can develop that over time once your confidence builds up. I would say that if you're really starting from scratch, start with things like herbs that are quite easy to grow. They're quite tolerant of a bit of neglect or a bit of overwatering or underwatering, just till you get your hand in and kind of get a feel for things. Because, as beginners often ask me, well, how often should I water? A plant, and it's kind of like, well, you have to kind of look at it and see, does it look like it needs water? Does it feel like the soil is dry? You can't just say, yes, definitely give it, a pint of water every 3 days, because different plants take up water at different rates. So you just have to kind of get to know your plants a little bit to build up that confidence. So if you start off with things that you can grow on a windowsill, or if you're sowing things to go out in the garden, if you start off by sowing them in trays, then you can see what they look like when they come up. So the other problem that often very new gardeners have is, if you sow out in a bed in the garden, how do you know which is your plant and which is the weeds around it? How do you make sure that you don't just pick out, when you're picking out the weeds, you don't actually pick out the plant that you've sown? So if you sow things in pots or in trays to start off with, you start to understand what plants look like when they first come out of the seed, and be able to say, oh yeah, that's definitely a carrot or a basil plant or a tomato, rather than a weed.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I'm definitely a culprit for that, actually. In our garden, my sister grew some spring onions. I didn't realise they were spring onions, and I just pulled them out thinking they were weeds.
Yeah, they look a lot like grass when they grow, don't they?
Yeah,
So it's like, oh, let's get that grass out of my bed. Oh dear, it's an onion. Yeah, everyone's done it. Everyone's done that.
Exactly. I think that's a good point. Like, know your surroundings, and once you know your surroundings, then that's when you can really start. And just a quick question, actually, you mentioned about kind of seedlings and seed sharings. For, again, new beginners, where's the best place to buy seeds? Is it just the supermarket? Is like that? I know you can get garden centres that sell them. Is there a difference? pests?
Okay, so it depends partly how green you want to be. So if you want to be very, very kind of climate friendly and very ecological, then you should look for seed that is labeled organic. So in the same way that we have organic food, if you think about where the seed comes from, there are basically farms where people grow food plants, but then instead of picking them as food, they let them go to seed, and then they gather the seed. So if you buy organic seed, it means that when those plants are growing, they won't have had any pesticides or fertilizers put on them, chemicals. If you buy non-organic seed, you can still grow it without the chemicals, you know, when you're growing it, but it may well have been grown in a field where chemicals have been used. So it partly depends on that. It also depends what kind of varieties you want. So there are very big, you know, seed companies. There is lots and lots of variety online that you can get, but there you can also just go down to your local, you know, supermarket or Wilko's and just pick up a packet of seed from there. That will be cheaper, and it's good to have a go. If you want to just practice with some of that kind of seed, then that's fine, and some of it will grow really well. But if you want to be really, really ecological from the outset, there are cooperative groups that do seed sowing. So there are people like Vital Seeds or the Real Seed Co-op that are really ethical companies and quite small, and, you know, have really high standards for their workforce and really high ecological standards. So again, it's really about how far you want to go down the line of, like, you know, integrating your ecological principles into your gardening.
Yeah. Interesting. And so I know you've kind of touched on the green aspect of things already. And I think now's probably a really good time to touch upon this then. Kind of how can you make growing your own food as environmental as possible, as sustainable as possible, as good for the environment?
Yeah, so the number one thing is to try to reduce any reliance on chemical, you know, fertilizers and chemical pesticides and that kind of thing. And the best way to do that is to build healthy soil. If you've got healthy soil, then that will, the microorganisms that are in the soil are going to live and die, and they will provide the nutrient cycle that will keep your plants healthy and growing. So you might still need to add some feed, some manure or some organic matter to build the soil. But once you've got a really healthy soil, it will start to become more self-sustaining. So in the same way that we have a whole ecosystem that we can see around us with trees and plants and animals, there's a whole ecosystem that takes place in the soil with all kinds of different organisms, some of which we can see, you know, like a beetle or a worm, we can see them, but there's also a whole range of creatures in the soil that we can't see, but who are busy moving nutrients around and helping to hold carbon in the soil as well. So healthy soils are a really, really important part of the fight against climate change, if you like. So, and the other thing that we can do with soil is to try and keep it covered. So if you walk through the countryside, sort of, you know, sometimes you'll see where fields have been ploughed up and the soil is bare. But if you want to grow vegetables in a way that is really ecologically friendly and climate friendly, we try to keep the soil covered. So that can either be covered with plants, so even covered with something like clover, or a really quick growing crop like radishes, you know, will grow really quickly and just keep the soil covered. Methi is a really good one for just covering the soil, coriander, those kind of things. Or we can use what we call a mulch. So that could be cardboard, it could be wood chip, it could be straw, it could be a soil conditioner, it could even be gravel, or sometimes even plastic sheeting, the big black plastic sheeting. But what we're basically doing is we're keeping the soil covered, and that helps to keep moisture in, and it helps to keep the weeds from germinating. So keeping our soil kind of like not bare, the more we plant in, the more we're going to encourage that relationship between plants and soil organisms as well, which is what we really want. So that's going to help the soil to be healthy. It's going to help the soil to distribute and hold water so that the soil becomes a bit of a sponge instead of the water just evaporating away. And that means that we don't need to water as much. But where we do need to water, we need to collect rainwater rather than using tap water, because tap water actually takes up a lot of energy to produce. So the water that comes out of our taps, has been through a very high intensity cycle of being cleaned and had chlorine put into it and been distributed over miles. So if we can reduce our reliance on tap water for gardening by collecting water, that's a really good thing to do as well. So yeah, I mean, there are lots of little hints and tips. Another thing that's really, really nice to do in terms of combating climate change is to grow, where we're growing vegetables, is to also grow companion flowers, and to mix up the vegetables that we're growing together. And again, that will help us to not need chemical pesticides, because the flowers actually attract beneficial insects that will eat the slugs or the nematodes or the flies that are going to be eating our plants. You'll get, again, that more balanced ecosystem in the garden, but also they look lovely and they lift your spirits. So yeah, trying in nature, you never see that kind of monoculture. You wouldn't walk somewhere and just see one plant growing in an area. Nature always chucks in as much variety as possible, and the reason for that is that then builds a system that is stronger than the sum of all its parts. So if you see what I mean, it kind of all supports, all the plants and animals are supporting each other. So if we sort of mimic that in our gardens, if we get away a little bit from that idea of everything being neat and tidy and in straight rows, then we're going to be working with nature, and we're going to be able to have more resilience during changing climate.
Yeah, really interesting. Like, a lot of those points, like, I wouldn't have thought of in terms of the covering the soil. That was really interesting. Does that have anything to do with preventing the sunlight going into the soil, or
it's yeah, sort of. I mean, if it's very hot, then the sun will actually burn off some of the microorganisms in the top layer of the soil, and also if the soil gets very dry, it's much more likely that when the wind blows, it's going to blow away bits of the soil. So you get that kind of topsoil erosion that you see on big fields, is where the fields get dry and dusty, and then the wind blows all the nutrients away, and the soil actually reduces. So we are losing topsoil across the planet, because of kind of agricultural practices. So one of the things that keeping the soil covered does is to stop that kind of erosion. But it's particularly good to keep the soil covered with plant matter, because then that will also, the roots of the plants will actually channel water and nutrients and move them around under the soil, rather than them getting blown away or burnt off by the sun.
Yeah, really interesting. And just really quickly, you mentioned about fertilizer and pesticides, and I think a lot of people are aware that fertilizers and pesticides are not good for the planet. They're not very organic, they're not very natural. But would you be able to just shed some light onto why they're not organic or natural?
Okay, so the fertilizer industry, okay, let's take one step back. So the things that plants need to grow, in the same way that we need vitamins, for example, plants need a range of different chemicals out of the soil. So they need different elements. So they need nitrogen, they need phosphorus, they need potassium, they need calcium, a bit like us, to build healthy bodies. They don't need a huge amount of those things, because they mostly rely on sunlight and water to build their bodies, their structures, but they do need a bit of that. So it really dates back to like the First World War, when Germany was very isolated from the rest of the world, and Germany's soils were very depleted. There was a process developed by a chemist called Fritz Haber to create nitrogenous fertilizers. And it's a very high intensity, very high energetic process. So it takes a lot of fossil fuels. But what it basically, there's a process called the Haber process, which takes nitrogen from the air and puts it into a form that is liquid that can be used then to feed plants. And what happens if you feed plants with that kind of fertilizer is they will grow really strongly. They will grow, they'll put on a lot of leaf, but they won't necessarily be able to resist diseases or fungus attacks because they're actually growing too fast, really. And so that leaves them vulnerable to other kinds of insect attack or fungal attack. And then you require then fungicides or pesticides on crops that are grown with chemical fertilizers to then be able to deal with that problem. And also, usually when people use those kind of nitrogenous fertilizers, the plants can't take up all of the nitrogen. They can't take up all of the chemical into their bodies, into their structures. And so we end up with this problem of runoff. So when it rains, we end up with nitrates going into our watercourses. And then that's what causes those algal blooms. So there's too much nitrate in the rivers then. It takes the oxygen out so that the fish die. And what you're left with is like algae that then takes over the watercourse or lake or whatever. So there's all these kind of knock-on effects that are caused by using chemicals. And in order to produce those chemicals, you have to use a lot of fossil fuels. As soon as you use fossil fuels, then you're starting to get, climatic effects. And the thing is that it's actually, we've become very, very reliant on that through the kind of industrialized agriculture process. But in our own gardens, we don't need to mimic that at all. We can use things. So there is a plant called comfrey, for example, that is, it grows quite high. It has really beautiful flowers that attract the bees, but it also is what's called a dynamic accumulator. So it has a big root that goes way down into the soil, and it will bring up nutrient from under the soil and put that into its leaves. So you can make a liquid feed from comfrey leaves for your tomatoes or your pumpkins or cucumbers once they start to set fruit. And that's just by, actually just having the comfrey leaves and soaking them in water, or even just leaving them to compress and a juice comes out of them that you can then dilute. And that is a perfectly good, extra feed for your tomatoes or your cucumbers without having any sort of outside chemicals. So seaweed as well. Seaweed is a really good natural fertilizer. Or nettles. You can make plant feed from nettles. So most people think of nettles as a weed, but you could cut some of your nettles, put them in a bucket and make a plant feed from nettles.
Interesting, really interesting. Yeah, thank you for explaining that. If I'm honest, I didn't actually realize the link between pesticides being, in a sense, a cure for fertilizers.
Yeah.
I thought they were very similar, if I'm honest. So yeah, it's really interesting. And I think actually I just wanted to touch upon some of the work you do next, if that's okay. So I know you work with the conservation volunteers in Leicester. And it would be great if you could really kind of like elaborate on the kind of work you do, and also for people watching, if they are from the local community, how they can get involved in food groups.
Yeah, definitely. So the Conservation Volunteers is a national charity that's been around since the 1950s. And our mission is to connect people with green spaces. So we know that communities are happier and healthier when they have a good connection with any kind of green space, but particularly when people are going out and doing meaningful work within nature. So we have conservation groups that go out into the countryside and they do work on woodlands or pond making or hedge laying, all those kind of conservation countryside skills. And then in the city, we have people that work on the parks, or the project that I'm involved, which is a public health funded project, which is called the Community Food Growing Support Program, which is all about getting new people into growing their own food. So the work that I do is I work with schools, I work with allotment societies, I work with community groups and with individuals who want to grow more of their own food. And I basically can help them in various different ways. I can either give them a bit of advice about their land and what they can grow on it, how to get started. In Leicester, we have some little grants called Get Growing grants that people can apply for. So they're not huge, but they just help people to get a few tools and seeds and things like that. And I kind of link up with that. But I also help people to write bigger funding bids as well. I can help people with things like if you've got a group and they want to take over some land, how to set up that group, how to have a constitution, or how to write a risk assessment, all of that kind of thing that groups might need. And then the other thing that we've been doing a lot during the pandemic is trying to find land for groups. So where groups have come together and they haven't got a plot of land to work on, I try and match make them with land around the city that's available, and to help them to get onto that land. So we've got new plots that are opening up in Beaumont Leys, near E2, and we've just taken on a direct let council allotment over in Belgrave, which is it's just the area of Leicester kind of known as the Golden Mile, and we've got like a lot of the Hindu community actually coming along and doing some food growing on that allotment plot. And then over the other side of the city, there are groups that all over the city there are groups running sort of community plots. And the other thing is that individuals, if they don't want to be part of a group, they can go onto the allotment waiting list and actually get an individual plot through the allotments as well. So and that's across everywhere, not just Leicester. If you're in any town across Britain, you are entitled to an allotment. Everybody is entitled to have an allotment, although there aren't always enough allotments to go around, but everybody is actually entitled to an allotment.
Yeah. So if people wanted to get involved with joining these community groups, kind of what would be the best way to go about that?
Yeah, so we have a Facebook group called Leicester Food Growing. So that's always a good start to just come on there and just say hello, and there are lots of people on there that will give you lots of help and advice. If you know that you've got land that you want to develop, people can contact me through my work email address, which we can put it out in the chat and stuff. Yeah, which is fine. Just contact me through that if you've got anything. And if groups want an allotment, then usually, in Leicester, you go to Leicester City Council. If you're outside of Leicester, there will be, some kind of allotment link, usually through your local authority. They will be able to advise you how to get in touch with your local allotments, or whether they're privately run or council run. Or if there are pieces of land that you've identified that you would like to grow on, quite often it's worth trying to find out who owns that land, because if it's not suitable for building on, then quite often people will be happy for people to take on bits of land, even if it's on a temporary basis. So there is this kind of idea of like meanwhile leases, where people go on and you might not grow in permanent structures, but you might grow in builders bags or in just planters for a while until that land is used for something else. So yeah, or people can obviously grow in their own homes and gardens, and there's so much advice out there for home growers now. It's just a huge there are lots and lots of websites and help available for that.
Yeah, fantastic. And finally, the last point I kind of wanted to touch upon, you've just briefly mentioned this, is COVID has made a lot of people obviously very confined to their homes, and these groups have come about in a really great way to help people socialize. And I'm sure you've seen it firsthand, but what are the benefits of growing your own food in groups by yourself for the environment? What are the benefits?
Yeah, definitely we saw this huge upsurge in people wanting to grow their own during COVID. And I think part of that was about food security, thinking back to the beginning of the pandemic, when there were worries about food security, and then people were taking up seed and compost and whatever. But I think it's unlikely that if you're a kind of normal urban family, you're probably not going to be able to produce all of your food in your own garden. So the benefits really are about, it's a really nice flow activity. So if you're feeling a little bit anxious, going outside, being in the fresh air, handling soil. Soil actually has really positive microbes. So we've built up a big fear of like the microbes with COVID, but there are also positive microbes, and the microbes in the soil actually interact with us, and they actually boost our serotonin levels. So they actually make us happy. So, you know, having some contact with the soil, as long as you're careful, obviously it's not got glass in it or dog poo or, you know, anything, but just be careful. But you know, actually contact with soil is really positive. Being out in the air and being in contact with natural sounds as well. So having a, you know, buzzing bees or birds singing, you know, it just uplifts our spirits. So, you know, there is a whole area of research about the fact that we are biophilic. We love nature. Naturally, we feel happier and calmer when we're surrounded by greenery and nature. So there's even been research done about people's recovery rate from operations in hospitals, where if people are in a hospital bed where they can see out of the window into a garden, they recover more quickly and require less follow-up care than people who are looking out on a brick wall. Because it's just that kind of mind, body, spirit, you know, connection that we have when we're out in nature. So there's that. And then obviously the food that we grow, if you grow without chemicals, you know, you're going to have food that is nutrient rich. So you're going to be eating food when it's really fresh. You're going to be eating things that are seasonal. You're going to be eating food that has a lot of vitamins and minerals, because it hasn't been transported and, you know, left to stand for a very long time. You can grow what you want, so you can grow things you like, so you've got that kind of choice. And if you plan it properly, you can grow so that you can have some kind of fresh vegetables all year round. So there are just so many benefits from it, of just growing food. But then when we take that into a group context, we get an even bigger benefit. So we then get all of that thing that comes from being in a positive team, of seeing people, of having a purpose that's beyond just ourselves. So the other thing that's been demonstrated to be really, really good for our health is to live with purpose. So if we're going and we're growing food, not just for ourselves, but say for a community project or for a food bank, that actually it actually improves our health more than if we're just growing for ourselves. Because psychologically, we are social animals, and we actually really thrive when we're working together as a team, you know, human beings. So you have all of those things. And then what we're finding is, particularly in the post-COVID period, that people don't feel very safe still socializing indoors, that there's still a lot of fear. There's a fear of strangers. But what we can do in the outdoor spaces, we can maintain that social distancing. You can have social interaction, but at a safe distance. And also because you're out in the air, there's less likelihood of infection as well. Obviously, we still have hand washing and, you know, maintain other kinds of COVID controls. But it really allows people to come together in a way that feels safe, but also to get that social interaction. So.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's been, in a sense, one of the kind of positive outcomes of having people staying at home, as they have really appreciated their gardens or their space, and the need, as you said, food security, again, need to actually be a bit more sustainable and not potentially always relying on these big supermarkets. You know, if you can do your small bit in your garden, you have the time, you know, why wouldn't you? So
yeah, definitely. And you know, I mean, I think some of the food banks, you know, during the pandemic, you know, that they've relied on community gardens, allotments, even individual allotmenteers bringing in some of the fresh food, you know. So, you know, a lot of organizations, obviously, you know, you get the donations through the supermarkets of like tinned food and pasta and that kind of thing. But any fresh food, it's really nice to connect that up with it actually having been locally grown.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Samantha. And we're now going to move over to audience questions. So if there are any more questions, please do pop them in the chat, but I've got a couple. So the first one came in and it said, what are the health problems that come from using pesticides and fertilizers, or are there any?
Yes. So again, it depends how directly you are in contact with them. So if you're a farm worker, you know, the chemicals that were developed in the post-war period for use in agriculture are the same chemicals that were used in the Holocaust to gas people in gas chambers. You know, they're derived from the same kind of chemical bases. So they are effectively poisonous. You know, the fact that the pesticides kill pests is because they are poisonous.
Yeah.
So if you think then about putting that into your body, they found that some of the pesticides that were used sort of in the post-war period have now been banned. So there was a pesticide called DDT, which is banned in the UK, but they've found that pesticide in the tissues, in the body tissues of like creatures right out in the Antarctic, because they've spread through the environment. They found it in the breast milk of breastfeeding mothers. And although those chemicals are banned in like Europe and America, they're not banned everywhere in the world. So if you have imported food, it's possible that there's still traces of things like DDT, you know, in the food. You know, some forms of farming use organophosphates, and they've been linked to farmers committing suicide, for example, because of the nervous effects that they affect the nervous system. So, you know, I don't want to get sued by Monsanto here, or, you know, whoever's producing the things, but there are a lot of so one of the really common weed killers that I sold for home gardening is called Roundup, and there are cases going through court in the States at the moment about whether Roundup, glyphosate, is a carcinogen. So I can't say for definite it is, but, you know, I wouldn't want to put it in. I definitely wouldn't want to feed my children with something that's been grown with glyphosate. So, but I think also there is the thing of it is not necessary. So we're told, you know, you can only have food if we have these chemical inputs. And actually there is a lot of scientific evidence, and there are wonderful farms where they manage without using these kind of chemicals.
Yeah.
So, and definitely in your home garden, you know, yes, it's really annoying. We've all been there. You know, I think we were talking about this before we came on air. You know, you come down in the morning and the slug has decimated, or the fox has decimated your beautiful cabbage or your lettuce. But the fact is, you can just sow it again. You know, you're not totally reliant on that. And if we encourage, you know, if you have slugs in your garden, encourage hedgehogs, encourage birds, encourage toads into your garden. You know, have a little pond, and then they'll eat the slugs. You know, there's always that balance. And yes, in the very wet weather, you know, the slugs will come out, and you do have to be vigilant, and you do have to go and collect them and do something, you know, put them in the compost bin or something. But, you know, we can share the planet even with the slugs, you know, without having to poison everything. So
yeah, and that leads on really well to actually the new question that's come in, which was, how would you advise to avoid pests when growing your own fruit and veg?
Okay, so I think the thing is that like I just said, what we're aiming for is a balance.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say for example, one of the pests we get is black fly. So if you're growing your beans and they get covered in black fly, it's really annoying. But one of the things that we can do is around our bean patch, we can grow nasturtiums. So nasturtium comes from the same family as peas and beans. That's that beautiful sort of orangey flower. You can eat them. They taste quite peppery. If you eat them, they look really nice in salads. But what will happen is if you plant nasturtium around your bean patch, is the aphids will prefer to go on the nasturtium than to go on your beans. So and it won't really hurt the nasturtium plant so much to have the aphids on. So you can do things like that are kind of like planting a decoy plant around, which will then help to pull the pests into that rather than your crops. Things like if you grow marigolds, English marigolds, they actually put out through their roots chemicals that help to deter pests and to deter weeds. So they're really great if you grow them around your garden as well. The wonderful slug You know, there are different ways of trying to deter slugs. So some people put out beer traps for them. So they put a little pot of beer and the slug goes and eats it and that kills it. But they also don't like climbing over anything that kind of their slime can't manage. So you can get like wool slug pellets, and it makes a rough surface that they don't like to climb on. Some people use little copper rings. For some reason, they don't like going around copper. So you can put copper rings around your plants. And you can use crunched up eggshells as well. That makes that can sort of deter them a bit. Yeah. So there are different ways of kind of dealing with different pests in your garden, but by far the best way to do things is to have a mixture of plants, to keep the soil covered, to encourage all of the wildlife to come in, and eventually you will get a bit of a balance, which is not to say that you won't lose anything to a pest. You probably will. Yeah. But you know, but if you've got a mixture of things, then some things will be affected by the pest and some things won't. The other thing to do as well is, if you've got space, is if you're growing, you know, quite in allotment style, is to rotate your crops. So if you've got one bed, for example, where you were growing cabbages, and another bed where you were growing tomatoes, yeah, you know, not to swap those over the next year, because there are some diseases that only affect tomatoes and there are some diseases that only affect cabbages. So if you try and grow the same thing in the same place year in, year out, you can build up a pest in that area or a disease in that area. Whereas if you move them around to different areas of your land, then you're less likely to get that build-up of pests and diseases. And the third thing is, if you have certain kinds of disease, then just be careful if you compost. So if you've got tomato blight or onion fungus, onion white rot, don't put those plants in your compost, because then you can be putting them back in the soil. So keep them separate and either drown them or send them to landfill, or you know, rather than putting them in your compost, and then you won't be building up so much disease in the soil.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you, Samantha. And I think with that, we're going to close the session off now. So just a quick few things. We will be posting this onto YouTube. So for people who have missed it, there is another opportunity to watch it again. If anyone has any more questions, please do throw them into the chat, into the comments, and we can get them answered after the talk.
Yeah, definitely.
And finally, just like to say a massive thank you for Samantha for joining today. So much I've learned, actually, and I'm sure the audience have too, about growing your own food. So it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me, Davina, and thanks, Rajesh, for doing the tech. And thank you everybody who's watched. Yeah, do drop me a line if you have any questions.
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.